What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show expecting a friendly conversation, only to face a barrage of disrespectful jabs that cross every line imaginable? In just 45 seconds, a single comment from the host would turn a routine interview into the most shocking exit in talk show history. Michael B. Jordan walked onto the Graham Norton set that evening with nothing but good intentions. He was there to promote his latest film, shake a few hands, share some laughs, and give the audience a good time. The studio lights were bright, the audience was buzzing with excitement, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Michael took his seat on the famous red couch, flashing that signature smile that had won over millions of fans worldwide. He looked relaxed, comfortable even, like he had done this 1,000 times before. And he had. Graham Norton opened with his usual theatrical flair, welcoming Michael to the show with exaggerated hand gestures, and that wide grin he always wore. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Michael waved and settled into his seat. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. They talked about the new movie, the training regimen Michael had endured to get into character, and some of the funnier moments on set. Michael was engaging, thoughtful, and gave the kind of answers that make for great television. He talked about the dedication it took to transform his body for the role, the early morning workouts, the strict diet, the mental preparation. The audience hung on every word. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Graham's questions started taking on a different tone. There was an edge creeping into his voice, a sharpness that had not been there before. He leaned back in his chair with a smirk that felt less playful and more condescending. "So, Michael," Graham said, his voice dripping with a strange mixture of amusement and disdain, "you've built quite the career playing these tough guy roles, haven't you? All these serious, brooding characters. Tell me, is that because it's easier to flex muscles than to actually, act?" The audience went quiet. A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd, but mostly there was just stunned silence. Michael's smile faltered for just a second. He blinked, clearly trying to process whether Graham was joking, or if he had actually just said what everyone thought he said. Michael took a breath and responded with grace. "I think every role requires a different skill set," Michael said calmly, maintaining his composure. "Whether it's physical transformation or emotional depth, I try to bring everything I have to each character. It's all acting, and it all matters." It was a measured, professional response. The kind of answer that should have moved the conversation forward, allowed them to pivot to something else, something lighter. But Graham was not interested in moving forward. Instead, he doubled down. "Oh, come on now," Graham said, waving his hand dismissively. "Let's be honest with the audience here. You're not exactly doing Shakespeare, are you? I mean, how much real talent does it take to punch people in front of a green screen and look broody? My niece could probably do that, and she's 12. The audience gasped. This was not playful banter. This was not the cheeky humor Graham Norton was known for. This was something else entirely. This was disrespect, plain and simple. Michael sat up a little straighter, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. But still, he kept his cool. He was a professional, and he was not going to let this rattling him show. "I respect your opinion," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. "But I think anyone who works in this industry knows that every role, every performance requires dedication and craft. I take my work seriously, and I'm proud of what I've been able to accomplish." There was a dignity in his response that made the audience want to stand up and applaud right then and there. But they remained seated, watching nervously as the tension on stage continued to build. Graham, however, seemed entirely unfazed by the discomfort he was creating. In fact, he seemed to be feeding off it. "Dedication and craft," Graham repeated mockingly, as if he were tasting the words and finding them distasteful. "That's a lovely way to dress it up, but let's call it what it is. You're a body. A very nice body. I'll give you that. But at the end of the day, that's what you're selling, isn't it? The abs, the biceps, the whole package. It's not exactly Meryl Streep territory, is it? Michael's expression changed then. The polite smile disappeared completely. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time since sitting down, you could see the anger starting to simmer just beneath the surface. But he still did not explode. He still did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with a quiet intensity that was somehow even more powerful. I think you're confusing physicality with a lack of talent, Michael said, his voice low and controlled. Just because someone works hard on their body doesn't mean they're not also working hard on their craft. I've trained with some of the best acting coaches in the world. I've studied characters inside and out. I've poured my heart into every single role I've ever taken. So with all due respect, Graham, I think you're way out of line here. The audience murmured in agreement. Some people even started clapping, trying to show their support for Michael. But Graham just sat there with that same smug expression on his face, completely unbothered by the fact that he was alienating everyone in the room. Out of line, Graham said, raising his eyebrows in mock surprise. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize we weren't allowed to have honest conversations anymore. I thought this was a talk show, not a fan club meeting. But if you'd prefer, I can just sit here and tell you how wonderful you are for 90 minutes. Would that make you feel better? The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. There was no hiding it. No pretending this was all in good fun. Graham Norton was being cruel, and he seemed to be enjoying every second of it. Michael took a deep breath, visibly trying to keep himself from saying something he might regret. He looked out at the audience, many of whom were shaking their heads in disbelief at what they were witnessing. I came here tonight to have a conversation, Michael said, his voice still remarkably calm given the circumstances. A respectful conversation. I didn't come here to be insulted or belittled. I've done nothing to you, Graham. I don't understand why you're treating me this way. For a moment, it seemed like maybe Graham would back down. Maybe he would realize he had gone too far and try to salvage what was left of the interview. But instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and delivered what would become the final straw. You want to know why? Graham said, his voice taking on an even more venomous tone. Because I'm tired of watching mediocre actors get praised like they're gods just because they have a good gym routine? You walk around like you're some kind of gift to cinema, but the truth is, you're replaceable. There are 100 guys who look just like you waiting in line to take your spot. You're not special, Michael. You're just lucky. And frankly, I think it's about time someone told you that to your face. The studio went completely silent. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Every single person in that audience was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of this disaster as it unfolded in real time. Michael sat there for a long moment, just staring at Graham. His hands were clenched into fists on his lap, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. You could see him fighting with himself, trying to decide how to respond to something so unbelievably disrespectful. And then, slowly, Michael stood up. He did not storm off. He did not yell or throw anything or make a scene. He simply stood up, straightened his jacket, and looked down at Graham with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and disgust. You know what, Graham? Michael said quietly. I've been in this industry long enough to deal with critics, with people who don't like my work, with tough interviews. But I've never, and I mean never, sat across from someone who was so determined to tear me down for no reason. I don't know what your problem is. Maybe you're having a bad day. Maybe you're jealous. Maybe you just get off on making people feel small. I don't know, and honestly, I don't care. But what I do know is that I don't have to sit here and take this. I have too much respect for myself to let you talk to me like I'm nothing. Graham opened his mouth to respond, but Michael held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not done," Michael said, his voice firm but still controlled. "You said I'm replaceable. Maybe you're right. Maybe there are 100 other actors who could do what I do. But you know what? They'd still deserve more respect than what you've shown me tonight. Every single person who steps onto this stage, who puts themselves out there for the world to judge, deserves basic human decency. And you've shown none of that. So I'm going to leave now, because I refuse to be part of whatever this is." He turned to the audience then, and his expression softened. He gave them a small nod, almost apologetic, as if he felt bad for cutting their evening short. "I'm sorry you all had to see this," Michael said to the crowd. "You deserved a better show than this. Thank you for your support. It means everything to me." And then he started walking toward the exit. The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. People were cheering, whistling, shouting words of encouragement. It was clear whose side they were on. Graham sat there, frozen in his chair, his smug expression finally starting to crack as he realized what had just happened. His producers were frantically talking into their headsets, trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. But there was nothing they could do. Michael B. Jordan was leaving, and there was no stopping him. As Michael reached the edge of the stage, Graham finally found his voice again. "Oh, come on, Michael," he called out, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "Don't be so sensitive. It's just a bit of fun. We're all friends here." Michael stopped walking. For a second, it looked like he might turn around, like he might come back and give Graham one more piece of his mind. But instead, he just shook his head without even looking back. "We're not friends, Graham," Michael said over his shoulder. "Friends don't treat each other like garbage." And with that, he walked off the stage and disappeared behind the curtain. The applause from the audience grew even louder, if that was possible. Some people were on their feet, pumping their fists in the air, clearly thrilled that Michael had stood up for himself. Others were shaking their heads in disgust at Graham, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Graham sat alone on that stage, suddenly looking very small and very foolish. He tried to laugh it off, to make some joke about actors being too sensitive these days, but nobody was laughing with him. The energy in the room had completely turned against him. "Well," Graham said weakly, looking at the camera with a strained smile, "that was unexpected. I suppose we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back." But the damage was already done. In the span of just a few minutes, Graham Norton had managed to alienate one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, turn his entire audience against him, and create what would surely become one of the most talked about moments in talk show history, and not in a good way. Backstage, Michael was surrounded by staffers who were apologizing profusely, trying to make sense of what had just happened. One of the producers, a kind-looking woman with worry etched across her face, kept saying how sorry she was, how Graham had never behaved like that before, how they had no idea what had gotten into him. Michael was gracious with them, understanding that this was not their fault. He thanked them for their concern, assured them he was fine, and politely declined their offers to try to smooth things over. "There's nothing to smooth over," Michael said calmly. "What happened out there speaks for itself. I'm not going back on that stage, and I think we all know why." The producer nodded, looking defeated. She knew there was no coming back from this. The interview was over, and there was no amount of editing or damage control that could fix what the live audience had just witnessed. Michael collected his things, said goodbye to the staff members who had been kind to him, and made his way toward the exit. As he walked through the backstage corridors, he could still hear the muffled sounds of the audience beyond the walls. They were still buzzing, still talking about what had just happened. When Michael finally stepped outside into the cool night air, he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. A small crowd of fans who had been waiting outside the studio immediately recognized him and started calling his name. He walked over to them, signing autographs and taking pictures, acting like nothing unusual had just happened, because to him, in a way, nothing had. He had simply refused to be disrespected, and he had walked away from a toxic situation. It was that simple. "Are you okay?" one fan asked, her eyes wide with concern. "We heard there was some kind of problem inside." Michael smiled at her, a genuine smile this time. "I'm fine," he said. "Really. Thank you for asking. Sometimes you just have to stand up for yourself, you know? Can't let people treat you like you don't matter." The fan nodded enthusiastically, clearly impressed by his composure. "You handled that so well," she said. Graham was completely out of line. "Everyone's going to be talking about this." Michael shrugged, his expression humble. "Let them talk," he said. "As long as the conversation is about respect and how we treat each other, then maybe some good can come out of tonight." He spent a few more minutes with the fans, making sure each person who had waited for him got a moment of his time, a picture, an autograph, a kind word, because that was who Michael B. Jordan was. Not the caricature that Graham Norton had tried to paint him as, not some vapid pretty boy who coasted on his looks. He was a thoughtful, talented, hardworking person who treated others with dignity and expected the same in return. Back inside the studio, the show was falling apart. Graham tried to continue with his other scheduled guests, but the energy was all wrong. The audience was distracted, whispering among themselves, checking their phones to see if anyone was talking about what had just happened yet. Graham's jokes fell flat. His interview questions felt hollow. Everything he said seemed to carry the weight of what he had done to Michael, and there was no escaping it. By the time the show finally ended, Graham was visibly rattled. His usual confident swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. The crew packed up in near silence. Usually there was laughter and chatter as they broke down the set, but tonight everyone just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. It felt like they had all been part of something ugly, something that nobody wanted to be associated with. Graham retreated to his dressing room without saying much to anyone. He sat there alone, staring at his reflection in the mirror, probably wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Meanwhile, Michael was already in a car heading back to his hotel. He looked out the window at the city lights passing by, his mind processing everything that had happened. He was not angry anymore. If anything, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had stood up for himself. He had refused to be diminished. He had walked away with his dignity intact. That was all that mattered. His phone started buzzing with messages. Friends, family, colleagues, all reaching out to check on him, to tell him they had heard what happened, to offer their support. He read through them with a small smile, grateful for the people in his life who had his back. One message in particular stood out. It was from a fellow actor, someone he respected tremendously. "Just heard about Norton. Proud of you for walking out. That took guts. You showed more class in 5 minutes than he showed in his entire career. Keep your head up." Michael typed back a quick, "Thank you," and put his phone away. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, letting the events of the evening wash over him one last time before he let them go. Tomorrow, there would be headlines, think pieces, social media storms. People would dissect every word, every gesture, every moment of that interview. Some would defend Graham, claiming Michael was too sensitive or couldn't take a joke. But most, he suspected, would see it for what it really was. A man standing up for himself against someone who had forgotten that respect is not optional. It is essential. The car pulled up to Michael's hotel, and he stepped out into the quiet night. The doorman greeted him with a warm smile, and Michael returned it. He rode the elevator up to his floor, walked into his room, and finally allowed himself to fully relax. He took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and stood by the window looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, people were already talking about what happened. The video clips were probably circulating online, being shared and reshared, analyzed and debated. But Michael was not worried about any of that. He knew the truth. He knew his worth. And he knew that he had done the right thing. What happened on that stage was not just about one bad interview or one rude host. It was about something bigger. It was about the expectation that celebrities should just sit there and take whatever is thrown at them, that they should smile and nod and be grateful for the platform, no matter how they are treated. Michael had rejected that notion completely. He had reminded everyone watching that being famous does not mean you forfeit your right to be treated with respect. That having a public career does not mean you have to accept abuse disguised as entertainment. As he got ready for bed that night, Michael thought about all the young actors out there who might see what he did and feel empowered to stand up for themselves too. All the people who had ever been made to feel small by someone in a position of power. All the times someone had crossed a line and gotten away with it because the victim was too afraid to push back. Maybe, just maybe, his decision to walk off that stage would inspire someone else to set their own boundaries, to refuse to accept disrespect, to value themselves enough to walk away from situations that diminish them. He climbed into bed and turned off the lights, a faint smile on his face. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but tonight he could rest easy, knowing that he had stayed true to himself, that he had not compromised his values for the sake of politeness or professional obligation, that he had looked disrespect in the eye and said loud and clear that it was not acceptable. And really, when you stripped everything else away, that was all that mattered. Michael B. Jordan had walked onto that stage as a man who deserved respect, and he had walked off as a man who demanded it. The difference between those two things, subtle as it might seem, was everything. In the days and weeks that would follow, people would remember this moment. They would remember the grace Michael showed, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. They would remember how he never raised his voice, never resorted to insults, never stooped to Graham's level. He had simply stated his truth, set his boundary, and removed himself from a toxic environment. It was a masterclass in self-respect, and it resonated with people far beyond the world of Hollywood and celebrity interviews. It reminded everyone that no matter who you are or what you do, you have the right to be treated with basic human decency. And if someone refuses to give you that, you have every right to walk away. The interview that was supposed to be a fun promotional appearance had instead become a defining moment. Not because of the conflict itself, but because of how Michael handled it. With dignity, with strength, with an unshakable sense of his own worth. Graham Norton had tried to make him feel small, but Michael B. Jordan had proven that he was anything but. He had shown the world exactly who he was, a man of principle, a man of character, a man who knew that respect is not something you beg for or negotiate. It is something you give and something you should expect in return. And when you do not get it, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. Head held high, integrity intact, leaving behind anyone who tried to diminish you to deal with their own reflection.